love, and compassion. As those who are saved by grace, we should always be ready to demonstrate God's mercy by extending grace to others. Here's Gene.
Saul, who became eventually the Apostle Paul, had an unusual motivation to practice this principle, and that is to demonstrate God's mercy by extending grace to others. And we see immediately after he became a believer and he was able to function, and after his eyesight was restored, here's what we read from Acts chapter 9, verse 19, the latter part of verse 19. He became immediate witness of what God had done in his life. We read, Saul was with the disciples in Damascus for some time. Immediately, he began proclaiming Jesus in the synagogues. He is the Son of God. Now, think about that. Here's a man who had put Christians to death because they believed that Jesus Christ was the Son of God. And were teaching that Jesus was the Messiah. And through this remarkable conversion experience on the road to Damascus, where Jesus appeared to him and said, I am Jesus, the one you're persecuting, Saul was converted remarkably, and then became later, under the name of Paul, the great apostle to the Gentiles. But immediately, he began to reverse what he had been doing by sharing the fact that Jesus is the Son of God. And notice we read, all who heard him were astounded and said, isn't this the man in Jerusalem who is causing havoc for those who called on this name and came here for the purpose of taking them as prisoners to the chief priests? It was Saul, but he was a different man. Now I want you to notice something that happens here in Luke's record, because there's a gap, a unique gap between verse 21 and verse 22. And I'll explain a little bit later how this can happen, but really what Luke is giving us here is history compressed. And when he talks about Damascus and what happened in Damascus, in the verses we just read, and then what happened in Damascus, in verse 22, there's at least a 3-year gap between those two verses. And we know that because of what Paul wrote in his letter to the Galatians, Later, after he had been on his first missionary tour into the Galatian region. And here he explains for us what happened to him after he came to Christ. After he had begun sharing Christ into Damascus, but rather quickly, he left. And here's what he wrote. But when God, who from my mother's womb set me apart and called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son in me so that I could preach him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately consult with anyone. I did not go up to Jerusalem to those who had become apostles before me. Instead, I went to Arabia and came back to Damascus. Now, what we're going to see in Luke's record is that he blends the first time in Damascus with the second time in Damascus. And here Paul is explaining what happened in between for 3 years. And he says, then after 3 years, I did go up to Jerusalem to get to know Cephas, that is Peter, and I stayed with him 15 days. Now, there are some who believe that when he says, I went into Arabia for these 3 years, that he literally went back to the area of Sinai, where God first revealed the law to Moses. And it was there for 3 years that he was taught by the Lord and by the Holy Spirit. And there was 3 years, a period of 3 years of discipling from the Lord himself to help Paul really understand the Old Testament as well as the coming of Jesus Christ and grace. And obviously, that then prepared him to go back to Damascus. Now, what happens is we pick up in the next verse the second event as I said, Luke blended these two events. And notice what happened. But Saul grew stronger and kept confounding the Jews who lived in Damascus by proving that Jesus is the Messiah. And after those 3 years in Arabia, after those 3 years where God literally taught him personally, he now comes back to Damascus and he is confounding the Jews by proving that Jesus is the Messiah. And after many days had passed, the Jews conspired to kill him, but Saul learned of their plot. And here we have reference to the fact that he escaped. So they were watching the gates day and night, intending to kill him. But his disciples took him by night and lowered him in a large basket through an opening in the wall. So basically, here we have Saul immediately preaching Christ in Damascus, then leaving Damascus for 3 years in Arabia, then coming back to Damascus. Luke compresses this and picks up the story the second time he comes back. And by the way, history compressed is something that's very normal and very natural. For example, someone might write my story and say, Gene was a student at Moody Bible Institute. And then he became a member of the faculty at Moody Bible Institute. Now, both are true, but basically there's a 2 to 3 year period between those two statements, because after I graduated from Moody, I spent 2 years in Billings, Montana, then came back to Wheaton, Illinois, then joined the faculty at Moody Bible Institute. In other words, both statements are true, history compressed, but there's a gap between, and that's basically what has happened here in Luke. He compresses history from the first event in Damascus, leaving for 3 years, coming back, and now he is persecuted and he has to leave as these people let him down in a basket outside that wall. And then he went to Jerusalem. So here's what we read. When he arrived in Jerusalem, he tried to join the disciples, but they were all afraid of him since they didn't believe he was a disciple. That was 3 years later. And that makes a lot of sense because there were still people in Jerusalem that remembered when Saul stood at the feet of Stephen and condoned his death. You don't forget things like that. They remembered what happened 3 years ago. They remembered when he left to go to Damascus to capture Christians. So when he comes back 3 years later, they're still afraid. And that's understandable. Here's what we read, though, and this is an amazing story because Barnabas walks on stage again. And here's what we read. Barnabas, however, took him and brought him to the apostles and explained to them how Saul had seen the Lord on the road and that the Lord had talked to him and how in Damascus he had spoken boldly in the name of Jesus. Let me share with you what Barnabas has done, which is to me very amazing. Here's his incredible grace towards Saul. Number one, Barnabas believed in Saul when others were skeptical. That's significant. But it wasn't blind faith because, number two, Barnabas described Saul's conversion experience on the road to Damascus. He found out about this man. He did research to find out exactly what happened to Saul. And thirdly, Barnabas reported on Saul's bold witness for Christ in Damascus. Now, why this is important is that here's a man who took time to get the truth and to share the truth with those who were doubting, even the apostles, to help them to understand what happened to Saul and why they needed now to trust him as being a true convert to Christianity. We read on because of the fact that they did accept him in verse 28 of chapter 9. Saul was coming and going with them in Jerusalem. In other words, Barnabas convinced them to accept him. Speaking boldly in the name of the Lord, he conversed and debated with the Hellenistic Jews, But they tried to kill him. And when the brothers found out, they took him down to Caesarea and then sent him off to Tarsus. And by the way, after that event, as nearly as I can calculate, he was in Tarsus for 6 years. And a lot happened in Tarsus during those 6 years. And we can maybe talk a little bit about that later. But he's still now in preparation for the fact that eventually Barnabas is going to seek him out and bring him back to help him in Antioch after that 6-year period. But here's a reflection and response question. Why is it often difficult to do for others what Barnabas did for Saul? Think about that. Barnabas took time. In the midst of doubt, in the midst of criticism, to get the facts. And I don't know about you, that ministers to me. One reason why we hesitate to defend somebody is insecurity. That the apostles were feeling that, even after those 3 years. It's risky. It's risky to believe in somebody who's been a murderer, unless you have the facts. And you see, Barnabas got the facts. It took time. And that's the thing I admire about Barnabas, is that he literally took time to get this information so that with a sense of security he could stand even in front of the apostles and defend Saul and his conversion to Jesus Christ. And I believe that's just another reason why Barnabas is called the son of encouragement. He was an encourager. And I really appreciate that. And that raises the question, in terms of my own life, do I have enough love to do this? I mean, that took love on the part of his love for this man. Do I have enough motivation to take on this kind of task? And I was challenged with that. And it happened about the time that I was thinking about Barnabas, because I got word that a friend of mine who was from Africa, who was ministering in Africa, that he was getting a divorce because he had committed adultery and was leaving his wife. And at that particular time, he had been over 5,000 pastors ministering in Nigeria. I said, that can't be. So basically, what I did is I called the man that had shared the story. Well, would you believe he got it from somebody else? So I called the man who got it from somebody else. And I traced it back. And when I traced it back to the source, this was a rumor that was based on his life, this man's life, when he was a pagan, an unbeliever, and they took information from years before, and started a rumor about his life at the present moment when God was using him. And I remember calling my friend and saying, do you know what the rumor is? And it just devastated him, which motivated me even more to get at the source of what happened. And of course, it was cleared up. Now, it would have been very easy for me to repeat the story, and for others to repeat the story and repeat the story. And I simply want to share with you that it was the story of Barnabas right here that was the motivation for me to trace down the result of that rumor and to find out that it was not true. So let's remember this principle to live by. As those who are saved by grace, we should always be ready to demonstrate God's mercy by extending grace to others, and that's exactly what Barnabas did for Paul. He extended grace, and we've seen how he demonstrated that grace in relationship to defending him and finding the truth.